Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman. Welcome to my watercolor tutorial for painting a gaggle of geese, or more specifically, a cute little family. The supplies I use for this painting include Fabriano Artistico rough watercolor paper, 140 pound, 9 by 12 inches, 23 by 30.5 centimeters. I used a pencil and a kneaded eraser. For my watercolor brushes, I used a black gold 311 round size 0, a Princeton Heritage 4050 liner size 2, and a Princeton Heritage 4050 round size 2. All my paints are Daniel Smith watercolors. I used New Gamboge, Yellow Ochre, Burnt Sienna, Sap Green, Manganese Blue Hue, Prussian Blue, Indigo. I also used water, a water container, paper towels, and table salt. My reference photo was taken by my brother-in-law, Gordon, of his own geese. I really love this sort of family setup we have here, but there were a couple of edits that I needed to make. One, I wanted to turn the goose's head that's looking out of the picture into the picture frame. And two, the baby goose is really hard to make out. So I wanted to make him a more defined baby. With those changes in mind, here is my line drawing. As you can see, I turned the mother goose to look into the picture, and I made the baby goose a more defined image. I start off by rolling a kneaded eraser across my drawing to pick up some of my graphite and make sure that those pencil lines are quite light. Once my drawing is lightened up, I'm ready to begin. And I want to start with a wet into wet background. So I'm using my largest brush to paint in water. I go pretty quickly everywhere except around the geese. I don't want to get this water into my geese. Once I've wetted this area, I will come in and add the background colors, and I don't want them bleeding into the birds. So you can see how quickly I go on the rest of the paper, and then I slow down to be careful around the edges of my drawn birds. Be generous with your water. You want to be sure that there's a lot of water on your background. If you're stingy with the water, it'll start drying in the corner where you began applying it before you've had a chance to apply it everywhere else. To start off, I'm just wetting the top portion of the paper, the part of the background that I anticipate will be the sky. I mix manganese blue with just a touch of cobalt blue. And I start applying it into that wet background. I leave plenty of white in the background also. By applying the paint while that paper is still wet, I ensure that I get soft, billowy clouds in the sky. And that's why I want to leave a lot of the white of the paper instead of painting every square inch. I work quickly because I don't want that water that I put down in the first layer to have a chance to dry. Again, I work quickly in the sky area, and then I'm rather careful around the geese. If I run out of blue paint like I'm doing here, it's easy enough just to mix another batch, and don't worry about having it match the first batch of blue that you used. You can see by painting a lot lighter in some areas and a little bit darker in other areas how I'm starting to create the sense of white clouds in this blue sky. And then I start in on the grass underneath the geese. Now this area is dry. I have not put water down on it, but the paint I'm using, my yellow ochre, is really quite wet, and I'm working quickly. My brush strokes are very organic, going in a lot of different directions. Don't paint this area with really smooth vertical or horizontal brush strokes. We want this to look like a dirt patch. So a lot of scuffling around. Now I've added burnt sienna into the mix. Same sort of brushstroke technique. And I don't want a really hard edge between my foreground and my background. In other words, I don't want a hard edge between the ground and the sky. So as I start painting up into the sky, I'll soften that edge. Here I've added sap green, more burnt sienna, and I slowly build up the colors. I want this to have a pretty patchy look, just like it does in the photograph. So in some areas I'm using yellow ochre, in other areas sap green, in other areas burnt sienna, and I let them blend together. I also want the ground to have some areas that are lighter and some areas that have a darker color. Before the edge between the sky and the ground has a chance to dry, I come in with a barely damp brush, has just a little bit of water on it, and I soften that background right up into the sky. Be sure your brush is not totally loaded with water, you just want it to be barely damp. This will help you smooth the edge between the foreground and the background. And then before any area has a chance to dry, I go back in to finish the second coat of sap green and burnt sienna and yellow ochre in the grass area. And before the sky has a chance to dry, I come in and add a little bit more manganese blue hue. Again, my brush stroke is very organic, not trying to paint in straight lines. To get a nice variety in the sky, sometimes I paint with thicker paint and sometimes it's slightly more watered down. Just like the grass, the sky will have a nice patchy look. And because I'm painting onto an area that is still damp, the entire background, I get nice soft transitions between these spots of darker blue, lighter blue, and almost just white of the paper areas. Now I've picked up some sap green. I'm coming in and adding a little bit more grassy patches to the foreground. For the most part now, my sky is dry and I'm just blending in some of the background grass into the sky. The background grassy area is just slightly damp and I want to add in a couple of blades of grass. For this, I pick up my thin liner brush and with fairly thick sap green, I make a few grassy brush strokes. Because this area is partly damp and partly dry, I get this beautiful effect of the grass. In some areas, it's blending right into the paint that's already on the paper. In other areas where the paper is dry already, I get these nice hard edges, creating very crisp blades of grass. I don't want to overdo it with these grass blades, but I'm looking for areas where I can add it in and blend it into the background. If it gets too hard edge, I just come in with a bigger brush and run it along the bottom edges of these grass blades, sort of running that paint together. I don't have any paint on my brush when I do that. I have mostly just a little bit of a damp tip. Then I go back to adding in little patches of brown dirt with that burnt sienna and blending in some of the sap green. Here I've picked up more of the yellow ochre at a thicker consistency. For the most part, I'm just looking for a nice variety of colors and textures and shapes in this patchy area. Once in a while, I go back in with that liner brush with its thin tip and brush in just a few more blades of grass. I don't want to overdo it, and it's time to let these areas dry. So I'm going to let my foreground and my background completely dry and turn my attention to the birds. I pick up burnt sienna and a touch of indigo at a pretty good consistency, maybe milky, So it's nice and dark. And using my Princeton brush, the number 2 liner brush, I start painting in some of the darkest markings I see. Notice my brush strokes. I'm not drawing with my brush. I'm using the entire brush to create these brush strokes, imitating the direction of the feathers. Where I want it to be a lighter gray, I just have a little bit more water on my brush. I continue painting with burnt sienna, indigo, and sometimes a mix of the two, imitating the feather markings I see in my reference photo. Notice the curve I'm using to paint in these feathers. They're helping describe the curvature of this goose's body. I don't want to paint these feathers straight across or straight up and down. I want this curvature, which helps us describe the volume of the bird. I leave little white specks of paper for the lighter parts of the feathers. This will give the feathers a nice airy look. Now I've added more indigo and just a touch of manganese blue hue to my brush. I pick up my big brush, which is just slightly damp, and I start painting in the shadowy area I see on the white throat. If you look at the reference photo, that shadow underneath the throat is really quite dark. Still using my big brush, I come in and add some more brush strokes in the feather areas, always imitating the brush strokes that I see when I look at that reference photo, the direction and the size. Before it has a chance to dry, I sprinkle a little bit of table salt on those feathers. That table salt will help add a nice texture to them. I've put down my big brush and now I'm using the liner brush again, that number 2 Princeton. And I'm smoothing out that manganese blue hue in the shadow area of the throat. If it's getting too dark or too watery, you can pick that excess up with your towel like I just did. Still using that smaller number 2 brush, I come in and start painting in the details I see in the head. Let's get a little closer. So here you can see how I'm building up the shadow. First with that really watery indigo and now a little bit more color on my brush. By building up the value slowly like this, I can make sure that I don't go too dark in this area. Now I pick up much thicker indigo and start putting in the darkest markings I see on the head. I avoid painting in the eye area. I'm painting around the eye for now. And I'm using the tip of my brush to add really light glazes of color. If inadvertently you find that you make a brush stroke and it's much darker than you thought, just take your towel and tap on it like I'm doing here. It helps lift out just a little bit of color. The more pressure you put on the towel when you lift, the more color you'll lift out. While I let that first goose dry, I turn my attention to the little baby, and for this I'm using mostly yellow ochre. For any shadowy areas, I use a watered down burnt sienna. And I'm using my smallest brush here, that liner, number 2 liner, just so I don't make those brush strokes too big. With that first coat on the baby, I'm moving on to the third goose in our picture. Always using the same colors. Right now it's burnt sienna, and I'm really playing with how much water is in my paint to determine how light or dark I'm going to paint an area. Here you see me creating a puddle of rather thick burnt sienna with a touch of indigo for that really dark marking down the neck. Again, I'm recreating the brush strokes I see in the feathers here. Be aware that the white of the paper acts as the white feathers on the goose. So you want to think about that as you're painting these brush strokes. Notice I use the entire tip to create these brush strokes. I often look for ways to leave white specks of paper showing through my watercolors. It adds a real glow to your watercolors. I never use white watercolor paint. So I have to sort of think ahead and plan ahead as I paint to remember to leave the white of the paper white where I want that brightness, since I won't come in over it later with white paint. White watercolor paint is pretty opaque and it just won't give you the glowing whiteness that the white of the paper does. Again, I use very watery manganese blue hue to create the shadowy area underneath this goose's tail. And before those feathers have a chance to dry, I sprinkle a little more table salt on this goose as well. Now I pick up yellow ochre and new gamboge, mixing them together. And I paint in a little yellow marking I see at the top of this goose's head and a little yellowy orange marking at the bottom that implies his foot buried underneath his body. I tend to put all the detail work in their heads when I do birds, and this is no different. I really study the reference photo, looking for the markings that I want to paint into the bird. Paying careful attention to the beak. I want to be sure that I keep the right size and proportions in the beak and the eye in particular. The beaks of these birds are their darkest markings, so for this I'm using fairly thick indigo. My paint is at a buttery consistency. If you use indigo that's too watered down, you'll find that the beak is not dark enough and it loses some of that wow factor. You really want this to be dark. I carefully paint the shape that I see on the top of the beak of the bird that's facing us. Notice I leave a little white speck of paper in the center just for a minute. I'm going to let that indigo soak into the paper and then I'll come in and soften the edges between the indigo and that white spot. That will really act as the highlight that I see in my reference photo. For as fast as I paint the bodies of the bird, I slow down so much to do the heads. This is where we captured their personality. Here you can see me softening up the edges between the indigo and that white highlight. Even the baby chick has black markings in the face. So for this, I want to be sure I just use the very tip of my brush to make the smallest markings possible for the shape of the eye and the shape of the beak. I'm using indigo, but slightly watered down. And then I come in with a little bit of burnt sienna, quite watered down, and add the shadowy areas I see around the little baby. I do leave little specks of white paper around him too, to give him an airy lightness. Once those first layers of dark indigo are dry on the beak and the face, I come in and do a second layer. And I come in and paint the eye. Again, with the eye, try to leave a little speck of white paper as a highlight inside the eye. And then study that reference photo to get some of these details put into the right places, having your brushstrokes go in the right direction to recreate the sense of feathers. I go over some of the white areas on the beak with manganese blue hue instead of leaving just the white of the paper. That lessens the contrast between that dark indigo and the white of the paper and creates more of a bluish casted highlight on the black beaks. And I continue to work a little bit on these feathers, deciding just how much detail I want to add. How much detail you choose to add to your birds is really a personal choice and up to you. I want to include mostly just a suggestion of the feathers and not get bogged down into painting each and every feather. I tend to put all of my detailed work around the face area. And in the rest of the bird, the background and the foreground, I like to do more suggestions. Here I'm coming in with manganese blue hue and doing a crisp edge between the head and the sky in the background. I do the same technique on the tail of the second bird, defining more clearly where the tail ends and that blue sky background begins. Undoubtedly, your painting at this point will look very different than my painting, and you have to assess for yourself what your painting needs. Do you have feathers that maybe want to be defined a little bit more? Are the dark markings on your geese dark enough? Have you softened the edge between the grass and the sky? I recommend watching my video to see the techniques, but then studying your own painting to understand where you need to apply the techniques. You might not need to darken things where I'm darkening them or soften things where I'm softening them, but you might have to darken or soften other areas in your painting. Take time to really observe the reference photo and compare it to your painting. Try to enjoy the process of observation. Spending time observing your reference and spending time studying your own painting will help you decide when you're done, how many details to add and how many to leave out. And here's my completed painting. I enjoy the suggestion in the foreground and the background and just the suggestion of feathers, while I've put most of my detail work into the expressions and details of their face. I hope you enjoy painting your gaggle of geese. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and as always, thank you for joining me.